Picture this. You're standing in the gilded chamber of a palace where the air tastes like perfume and madness. Through the silk curtains you hear laughter, high, unhinged, childlike, echoing off marble walls that have witnessed things no stone should remember. A figure dances past you, draped in women's clothing, face painted white as death, eyes gleaming with something that isn't quite sanity. Behind him, a trail of blood leads to a room where screams have become so commonplace the guards no longer flinch. This is power without constraint. This is what happens when the human mind receives everything it desires and nothing it needs. Tonight, you're about to meet 15 rulers who prove that the most dangerous weapon in history isn't the sword or the flame. It's the unchecked human heart. Before we descend into these forgotten corridors of power, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from. It genuinely amazes me that we're exploring these dark chapters of humanity together across continents and centuries, connected by our shared fascination with what people become when no one can tell them no. The story begins not with a monster, but with a boy named Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, born in 37 AD into Rome's imperial family. History would remember him as Nero, but before he became the emperor who fiddled while Rome burned, he was just a child who wanted to be loved, to be seen, to be remembered as something magnificent. His mother Agrippina poisoned her way to power, placing her son on the throne at 17. What she created wasn't an emperor. It was a wound dressed in purple, a hunger that would consume a city. Nero's obsession began innocuously enough: poetry readings, musical performances, theatrical displays. But Rome's senators didn't attend because they enjoyed his art. They came because guards stationed at every exit made leaving impossible. Those who dared to sleep during his 8-hour recitals were carried out on stretchers, feigning death because unconsciousness was the only acceptable excuse for absence. Women pretended to go into labor mid-performance, knowing childbirth was the singular escape his ego would tolerate. The emperor's voice cracked on high notes. His timing was mediocre, but in his mind, he was Apollo himself. And disagreement wasn't just an insult, it was heresy. The truly disturbing part wasn't his delusion, it was his commitment to it. Nero competed in chariot races where the outcomes were predetermined with such obviousness that it became grotesque theater. In one infamous race, he fell from his chariot entirely, never completed the course, and was still crowned victor. The judges handed him the laurel wreath while his horse crossed the finish line riderless. He accepted it with tears of joy, convinced of his own athletic supremacy. Then came the fire of 64 AD, 6 days and 7 nights of flames that devoured neighborhoods, temples, homes where generations had lived and died. Ancient sources debate whether Nero started it himself, but what's undeniable is what he did while it burned. As citizens fled through smoke-choked streets, as children suffocated in their beds and elderly couples chose to die together rather than face the flames, Nero stood on his private stage performing The Sack of Troy. He sang of ancient destruction while watching modern annihilation unfold, his voice competing with the screams below. Witnesses reported that he seemed transported, eyes closed in rapture, lost in the performance of his life. The cleared land became his canvas. He built the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, a palace complex sprawling across 300 acres of central Rome's heart. It featured an artificial lake, rotating dining rooms, ceilings that showered flowers and perfume on guests, and a 120-foot bronze statue of himself as the sun god. While Romans lived in refugee camps, their emperor reclined in rooms painted with gold leaf, satisfied that he'd finally created a home worthy of his artistic soul. But Nero's appetite for performance extended into territories that shocked even Rome's jaded elite. When his wife Poppaea Sabina died, kicked to death during his rage in 65 AD, he didn't mourn in conventional ways. Instead, he found a young man named Sporus, who resembled her and had him castrated. Nero married Sporus in a formal ceremony complete with wedding veils, dowry negotiations, and a bridal procession through Rome's streets. He dressed him in empress's clothing and introduced him as his wife at state functions, expecting courtiers to bow and use female honorifics. Later, in a ceremony that reversed the roles, Nero married another man named Pythagoras, this time playing the bride himself, veiled, submissive, performing femininity with the same dedication he brought to his theatrical roles. When rebellion finally came in 68 AD, Nero couldn't die like a Roman. He spent his final hours not preparing for battle or negotiating peace, but rehearsing different ways to deliver his death scene. He practiced various poses with the dagger, tested different final words for dramatic impact, wept over the loss of his artistic genius to the world. His actual last words, recorded by the historian Suetonius, captured everything about his fractured reality. Qualis artifex pareo. What an artist dies in me. Even at the precipice of annihilation, he saw himself not as a failed emperor, but as a tragic performer, and Rome's burning was just his most misunderstood masterpiece. From Nero's ashes we encounter another prodigy of excess, Elagabalus, the 14-year-old Syrian boy who became emperor in 218 AD through his grandmother's political machinations. Where Nero craved artistic immortality, Elagabalus pursued something more fluid, a complete dissolution of identity itself. He brought his sun god to Rome and built a temple on the Palatine Hill, but his worship went beyond devotion. He castrated himself during religious ecstasy, danced around altars in silk robes and cosmetics, and forced the Senate to watch as he performed rituals that blurred every line between East and West, male and female, sacred and profane. He appeared in public wearing makeup, jewelry, and women's clothing, not as costume, but as identity. Roman historians record that he asked physicians to surgically transform him into a woman, offering staggering sums to any doctor who could perform the procedure. His marriages multiplied, wives and husbands simultaneously, ceremonies that mixed traditions until no one could distinguish what was real. His relationship with Heracles, a former slave and chariot driver, became his most enduring. Elagabalus called him husband, took the role of wife, removed his body hair, and painted his face to appear as feminine as possible. He allegedly operated a brothel from the imperial palace, personally soliciting customers while wearing a prostitute's wig, not for money but for the experience itself. What disturbed Rome wasn't just his sexuality, it was his joy in it. Elagabalus elevated his lovers to the highest positions in government. A chariot driver commanded the Praetorian Guard, a former slave became his chief advisor, an actor received a military command. Qualified generals and experienced senators watched as their empire was governed by the emperor's bedroom companions, men whose only qualification was having pleased him. The ancient traditions that held Rome together for centuries dissolved like salt in water. The end came swiftly in 222 AD. His own grandmother, Julia Maesa, who had orchestrated his rise, ordered his assassination. The Praetorian Guard dragged the 18-year-old emperor from his hiding place and butchered him in the palace latrines. They dragged his body through Rome's streets, dumped it in the Tiber River, and erased his name from every inscription. But even damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, couldn't make people forget the boy emperor who had shown them that gender, tradition, and power itself were more fragile than anyone wanted to believe. Then there was Caligula, born Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus in 12 AD, nicknamed for the miniature soldier's boots he wore as a child among his father's legions. His transformation from beloved young emperor to deranged tyrant happened almost overnight. After falling ill in 37 AD, something in his mind shattered. He emerged from his sickness bed believing he was a living god, and he spent the next 4 years proving that divinity without sanity is indistinguishable from hell. He held conversations with statues of Jupiter, sometimes arguing violently with the marble figure. He built a bridge from his palace to Jupiter's temple so he could visit his fellow god more easily. Servants reported finding him laughing with invisible companions in the dead of night, or covering Jupiter's statue with cloth during thunderstorms because he believed the god was trying to frighten him. But Caligula's madness had teeth. He forced elderly senators to run beside his chariot for miles, then laughed as they collapsed. He made them fight as gladiators, watching with delight as arthritis-crippled hands struggled to lift weapons. During a banquet, he burst into sudden laughter. When guests asked what amused him, he replied, "I just realized I could have you all killed right now." The laughter died. His treatment of his horse Incitatus became legendary. The animal lived in a marble stable with ivory manger and purple blankets. Caligula appointed the horse as a priest and allegedly planned to make it a consul. Dinner guests were required to speak respectfully to Incitatus, who ate from golden bowls while senators' families starved from Caligula's taxation. The emperor's sexual cruelty was systematic. He committed incest with his sisters publicly and forced senators to watch as he assaulted their wives and daughters, sometimes during dinner parties. He'd send soldiers to drag women from their homes and return them hours later, often describing in graphic detail to their husbands and fathers what had been done. When Cassius Chaerea and other Praetorian officers finally cornered him in an underground passage in 41 AD, they stabbed him 30 times. His wife and infant daughter were also murdered. The Senate attempted to restore the Republic, but the Praetorian Guard had already tasted imperial gold. Democracy's brief resurrection lasted hours. Across centuries and continents, the pattern repeated with variations. Genghis Khan, born Temujin around 1162 AD, perfected terror as a weapon, catapulting plague-infected corpses over city walls, systematically raping enemy leaders' families while they watched, executing every man taller than a wagon wheel to ensure only traumatized children survived to spread fear. Vlad the Impaler arranged 20,000 Ottoman prisoners on stakes outside Targoviste in 1459, dining among the forest of dying men while conducting diplomatic negotiations. The smell of death and the sound of moaning made discussion impossible, exactly as Vlad intended. Moctezuma II's daily bloodletting rituals, piercing his own ears, tongue, and genitals to collect offerings for the gods, preceded his selection of human sacrifices from elaborate prison complexes where captives were fattened for the gods' pleasure. The dedication ceremony for the rebuilt Templo Mayor in 1487 allegedly consumed 20,000 prisoners over 4 days, the temple steps painted red, the city stinking of death for weeks. When Cortés arrived in 1519, Moctezuma's religious delusion made him believe the Spaniard was the returning god Quetzalcoatl. Faith blinded him to conquest standing at his door. Charles VI of France believed he was made of glass and would shatter if touched, spending hours frozen in place while his kingdom collapsed into civil war. Ivan the Terrible alternated between prayer and execution, his forehead bleeding from striking stone floors in religious ecstasy before ordering mass drownings and torture. He killed his own son in 1581 with his metal-tipped staff during a rage, then spent 3 days alternating between grief and fury, his heir's death ensuring Russia's future chaos. Ibrahim the Franqueurs of the Ottoman Empire, emerging from 22 years in the palace's golden cage, built a harem of over 1,000 women and had 300 of them sewn into leather bags and drowned in the Bosphorus when he suspected one of infidelity. Louis XIV transformed every moment of his existence into theater. His morning awakening took 2 hours with 24 courtiers performing specific roles while he sat motionless like a statue being worshipped. The Duchess of Burgundy once stood for 3 hours with a broken ankle rather than leave without royal permission, her face pale with pain, while the Sun King continued his routine unchanged. Henry VIII's 6 marriages and his break with Rome over divorce revealed that personal desire could shatter religious unity that had lasted a millennium. Anne Boleyn, pursued for 7 years, was executed on fabricated charges after failing to produce a male heir. Henry watched from his window, then celebrated their daughter Elizabeth's illegitimacy within hours. His rotting leg ulcers gave off such stench that courtiers could detect his approach from rooms away. Yet his portraits showed him slim and powerful, delusion preserved in paint. What connects these 15 minds isn't simple cruelty or excess. It's the complete dissolution of feedback, the total absence of anyone capable of saying no and meaning it. Power didn't create monsters, it revealed them. These were human beings born with the same capacity for love and reason as anyone, but absolute authority acted like acid on their humanity, dissolving conscience, empathy, and eventually sanity itself. Nero began as a boy who wanted to create beauty. Elagabalus sought authentic self-expression. Caligula was once Rome's beloved young prince. The transformation happened not despite their power, but because of it. The courtiers who bowed before burning Rome, the concubines who drowned in the Bosphorus, the senators who ran beside chariots until their hearts burst, they all woke each morning hoping for ordinary things. A meal, safety, perhaps a moment of joy. Instead, they became extras in tragedies written by minds so warped by unchecked authority that they'd forgotten what it meant to be human. Their rulers began as children who laughed and cried and dreamed, and ended as nightmares that haunted civilizations long after death. The tools change across centuries. Social media manipulation instead of impalement stakes, economic warfare instead of biological weapons, psychological operations instead of religious terror. But the fundamental dynamic remains. Power still flows through human hands. The capacity for both creation and destruction still lives in every heart that beats with authority over others. We've simply learned to hide our monsters better, to dress our cruelties in the language of necessity and progress. Tonight, somewhere in the world, someone holds power without constraint. Someone makes decisions that affect thousands of lives, and no one can tell them no. The ghosts of these 15 kings walk among us still, reminding us that the line between ruler and monster isn't carved in stone. It's drawn in sand, easily erased by winds of ambition and control. In the end, they were all just human beings who forgot they were human. And perhaps that's the most terrifying inheritance they left behind. The knowledge that it could happen again, is happening now, will happen tomorrow, because power's corruption follows laws as reliable as gravity. The only question is whether we'll recognize the pattern before the marble halls fill with screams, before the flames rise, before another voice cries out in the darkness, and no one powerful enough to stop it cares enough to listen.